Good evening. I want to thank you for joining us for the 2022 UConn Center for Judaic Studies Academic Convocation on the Holocaust with Professor Noah Shenker of Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. My name is Avinoam Pat. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life here at the University of Connecticut. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this evening's program, including the Dodd Center for Human Rights and Human Rights Institute, as well as our wonderful colleagues at Voices of Hope for also helping to promote tonight's lecture. And I want to thank all of you for being here for this evening's program. Before we begin, just a few technical notes. You'll notice that all of you have been muted as you enter the Zoom room. This is to minimize disruptions and distractions as the program goes on. We will encourage you to use the chat feature to ask questions as Noah lectures, and we'll have time for Q&A after the lecture for discussion. This program is also being recorded and will be loaded and available on the UConn Center for Judaic Studies YouTube channel if you'd like to view a recording. As is traditional at our annual academic convocation on the Holocaust, we also like to celebrate the wonderful academic achievements of our students in this academic year. And normally we would be able to do this in person at the Conover Auditorium at the Dodd Center at the University of Connecticut. But I just want to mention a few of our award-winning students from this past year, including the recipients of the Sylvia and Leo Deshevsky Award for Excellence in Hebrew Studies, Ryan Mirace and Angelica Jimenez Ravanelli, the recipients of the Cohen-Hennis Award for Excellence in Judaic Studies, Madison Zuckerman, Connor Treadwell, and our PhD student Yosha Yelitsky. And as always, a special thank you to the Francis and Irving Seliger Memorial Award for Holocaust Studies, which promotes much of the work and supports our continued research and engagement in Holocaust studies. This year's recipient of the Seliger Memorial Award for Holocaust Studies is Angelica Jimenez Ravanelli for her exceptional work in Holocaust studies this year. As many of you know, this past Thursday, we marked Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, designated by Israel's Knesset in 1951 as the 27th of Nisan, a day to remember the destruction and the heroism of European Jewry. As we do annually, we mark Yom HaShoah with an academic convocation on the history of the Holocaust. This year, we note 77 years after the end of the Second World War, that thinking about the future of Holocaust memory seems more urgent now than ever. Not only because we can observe the passing of the last living eyewitnesses to the Shoah, but also because we see in real time how the memory of the Holocaust can be distorted and trivialized by politicians, anti-vaxxers, and autocratic dictators. This is why I'm so pleased to welcome our brilliant speaker for tonight's program. Dr. Noah Shenker is the N. Milgrom and 6A Foundation Senior Lecturer in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Monash University's Australian Center for Jewish Civilization. Noah received his PhD in Critical Studies in 2009 from the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts. His research and teaching traversed Jewish studies, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, cultural studies, and cinema and media studies. That interdisciplinary approach was at the center of his first book, which I have here, Reframing Holocaust Testimony, published in 2015 by Indiana University Press as part of its Modern Jewish Experience series. The book is organized within a comparative framework and looks at three of the most extensive and distinctive archives of Holocaust testimony in the world: the USC Shoah Foundation Institute, the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Noah investigates how the cultural and institutional histories and practices of those sites mediate the encounters between interviewers and interviewees, and consider the extent to which testimonies are driven by the agency of witnesses and the itineraries of a given archive. Noah is currently working on a co-authored book with Associate Professor Dan Leppard entitled Beyond the Era of the Witness: Testimony, Digital Media, and the Afterlives of a Holocaust Memory. As that work explores Although still grappling with the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, we are encountering yet another moment of aftermath. The quote, era of the witness, marked by a consolidation of survivor memory through film, testimonies, and other media, is transitioning to a period when witnesses will no longer be present to anchor representations with their living moral authority. Noah is currently working on this project as a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. And tonight's lecture by Noah Shenker takes the same title as the title of this forthcoming book, Beyond the Era of the Witness, Testimony, Digital Media, and the Afterlives of Holocaust Memory. I'm so pleased to welcome our friend who is literally joining us from the future, from tomorrow morning in Australia, to speak with us on this topic. Thank you for being here, Noah.
Well, thank you, Avi, for that incredibly warm introduction. And while I'm sharing my screen, actually, hold on, let me just stop sharing for a moment. I want to share the screen and make sure that I have all of the boxes ticked, as we say in Australia. I want to first thank Avi and the co-sponsors for inviting me to give this talk. It's a genuine honor. And I also just want to thank Avi as well in his way of kind of echoing his sentiments about me by saying that the work that I've done over the years would not have been what it was if not for Avi's really brilliant insights as a reader on my book, as a reader on many different things that I've done. It's been just an essential part of the work that I've done over the years to have Avi as a collaborator, as someone who has provided a careful eye and very attentive ears for the work that I'm doing. It's something that we continue to work together in various things, and it's really been an honor to work with Avi, Professor Avi Nompat. Sorry if I lapse into the informalities that are the custom of Australia. I've never once been called doctor or professor here. I'm just Noah. And so today's talk is, as Avi mentioned, based on the book that I'm currently working with with a collaborator of mine, Dan Leopard, whose email address you can find there along with my own. Now, just to make sure, Avi, you can't actually see the gallery on the PowerPoint, can you?
No, we just see the slideshow, but not the presenter view.
Okay, great. Now, what's going to be discussed today is a snippet of work for this larger book, and that will be appearing as a chapter in a volume that Avi is co-editing with Northwestern University Press, which is based on the Lessons and Legacies biennial conference that they do on Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And this is a project which I've been working on with Dan for quite some time, and you might be a bit taken from aback, perhaps by some of the images you see even on this open slide. You see a video, you see a screenshot of a video testimony given by Pinkas Guter, a Polish Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, on the left, a rendering of him as an interactive witness for the New Dimensions, I should say the Dimensions and Testimony project for the Shoah Foundation, and then a cartoon rendering that my collaborator Dan Leopard has sketched as part of our project. This project, while I'll only be showing some snippets of the graphic elements, and by graphic I mean the elements that are incorporating comic art into this scholarship, I do want to at least raise it as it will be germane to some of the topics I'll be exploring throughout today's talk. Now, by the time that Dan and I had our third encounter with the Holocaust survivor Pinkas Guter in May of 2016, he had taken up a new home within the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., now at this point, at least at that point, occupying a corner of its Wexler Learning Center. Now, unlike the miniature 18-inch version of him that we had seen in earlier pilot versions at the USC Shoah Foundation's office in Los Angeles, this version that you see here on the screen shows Pinkas on a large screen rendered in approximately 3/4 of his actual size. And unlike in earlier installations, he can now respond with 50,000 unique answers, up from the 25,000 he had previously been able to deliver. Located adjacent to the museum's Hall of Remembrance. So for those of you who have been to the Holocaust Museum, which I'd imagine would be a large number of you, you know that the Wexler Learning Center stands near the entrance of a small gift shop. It's part of the museum that is outside of the permanent exhibition. And the Wexler Learning Center had served initially or been designed initially as a place for interactive learning, as a place where multimedia resources would be made available, video testimonies would be available to audiences. So the space of Holocaust memory, as it became structured within the United States Holocaust Museum, was always from the onset an embrace of new technology. So too in the Fortunoff Archive at Yale University, so too with the USC Shoah Foundation. The work of testimony collection and of Holocaust museum preservation and display and curation has from the onset been heavily reliant on new media. So new media is not at all alien, is in fact quite essential and has always been foundational to the construction of Holocaust memory within the United States. Now, getting back to Pinchas Guter here is rendered on this screen. We found him, as we said, resting in the corner of that temporary exhibition, an exhibition that's no longer available. You can, of course, now visit Pinchas in his interactive form at places like the Skokie Museum, at the USC Shoah Foundation, at museums in Dallas, at one point at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, and other places throughout the world. But when we saw Pinchas here in 2016, he was in this corner and he was curated, if you will, alongside a Russian Jewish emigre to the United States, a docent, a volunteer docent at the Holocaust Museum. And she encouraged people to come in, almost as if a carnival barker. Come, she said, come see the 21st century technology that brings testimony. It's done for the future generations who won't be able to communicate with survivors in their physical forms. She's been instructed to read off of a script, to provide context for the Dimensions and Testimony project, but she quickly dispenses of that duty and rallies museum goers into the space and teaches them how the technology is to work. So I'm going to show you a clip. Now, what you have is, as I said, a screen which is two-dimensional. This is not a counter to, and I'll discuss this in a bit, this is not a holograph. At no point have there been holograms of Holocaust survivors rendered by the Shoah Foundation. It's an aspiration. That language has been used. Holograms, Holocaust holograms. At no point has there ever been a hologram created by the Shoah Foundation of a Holocaust survivor. It's the idea that at some point the technology may exist to facilitate that. Certainly something that they aspire to, but is not yet that it's something that has been actualized. She sits here, stands here rather. There's a desk placed about 10 feet away from the two-dimensional screen. There is a button on a microphone, a mouse rather, and a microphone that you can engage in conversation with the virtual Pinchas. So here I'm going to show you a brief clip that I took. I apologize, I did receive my PhD in cinema and media studies at USC, but not in cinema making, not in production. So the production value is quite terrible, but I think it should at least capture the essence of what I'm getting at.
And keep it pushed until you finish your question.
Can you tell us about your story? I have no idea where you came from, your upbringing, what happened in the beginning, and how did it affect you? How old were you when it all started to change?
I was 8 years old.
You may want to ask him.
See, excuse me, we may help you. This is a computerized system. Make your questions a little bit shorter.
What happened to you in the beginning? Tell me your story.
Is it difficult to tell my story to you? It's difficult, but it's also cathartic and gratifying. So it is, you know, it's two faces. It's two things. It's both difficult and important. It's also very important to share my story with everybody, because I think it's very important to be able to overcome and avoid doing what happened. It is possible. You have to know what happened to be able to avoid it, and you have to be able to bring some goodness into yourself and allow the goodness that is inside you, because we all have got the good and bad. You've got continuous fight between the good angel and the bad one, the one that pushes you, toward doing bad things, and the one that pushes you toward doing good things. So we had a constant fight, which started already in the womb of Rivka, when she had Esau and Jacob, and the Bible tells you, and they were fighting in her womb. So these two souls were already fighting inside her womb.
Now, a couple of things I want to point out. On one hand, I think you see the limitations of this system, the faults of the system. Initially, the user tries to engage in a more conversational set of questions, running off of a list of various questions. And the system is, and I'll talk about the nature of the system, the voice recognition system, is not equipped to deal with multi-pronged questions, layers of complicated questions. It's really structured to deal with a discrete, direct question. It does evolve, it does learn over time as a machine-driven, artificially intelligence-driven, as well as manually coded system. But here you see that when asked with, posed with questions that are quite complex in nature or multi-layered in nature, Pincus can't pick up on it. When he does pick up on the second line of questioning that the user asks, you do note a couple of things that I noted, and I've noted throughout my ethnographic work with watching and studying different users who've used this testimony in different locations over time, is a sense of attentive, or at least the appearance of an attentive listener, someone who is nodding their head, someone who is remaining in eye contact with Pincus. We ourselves found ourselves feeling a sense of obligation to give him our attention, to nod in agreement with Pincus. And that's something that I'll elaborate on in just a few moments. But I do want to just continue to give you a bit of context. The DIT was conceived by the USC Shoah Foundation, which is based obviously out of USC in Los Angeles, as part of and in collaboration with a research unit at USC called the Institute for Creative Technologies, ICT. Now, the ICT was initially founded through DARPA. Now, that's the Department of Defense research wing, with the deliberate purpose of producing, at least ICT was created with the deliberate purpose of producing simulation scenarios that could serve as training modules for officers and recruits in various branches of the US military. This technology was originally utilized to train incoming troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, as you see in the image on the top right. But then was repurposed or kind of directed towards providing virtual psychotherapy for those very soldiers who returned from battle in Afghanistan, Iraq with post-traumatic stress disorder, creating virtual psychotherapists for the very soldiers who had been trained by the very same technology for being embedded in that war in the first place. And that's a whole other Pandora's box we can open up and discuss in questions and answers, but it's not something I'm going to focus on and for this particular talk. As with many of the prominent survivors who appeared either in video testimony or on digital interactive screens, Pincus DIT, and I will often shift back between calling him Pincus and Pincus DIT, as a way of kind of articulating the confusion, right? Initially, and certainly at the beginning of this talk, I refer to him as Pinchas Gooter as if the virtual witness was Pinchas Gooter. I've never met Pinchas Gooter. I've read his memoir. I've been to the virtual reality film, The Long Goodbye, The Last Goodbye. I've seen multiple testimonies and heard multiple testimonies from him, but I've never met Pinchas Gooter, the man. He's still alive, living in Toronto, from what I understand. And so even that slippage is important. To what extent does Pinchas and this cohort of virtual survivors constitute real witnesses? And it's interesting to note that the Shoah Foundation, in my meetings with them, will say, no, that is not a simulation, that is Pinchas Gooter. So that slippage is very much built into the core of the concept and the production and methodology behind these witnesses. Doesn't mean that we should take them as such, only that they are positioned as such. But these survivors who have been rendered nearly 30 at this point, all have, in essence, were selected for a particular purpose because they were of a particular age that they could endure, still endure the being under the Klieg lights, being asking questions for multiple days, thousands of questions. But Pinchas had, as the pilot for this program, the first to be interviewed for this program, was selected for a series of reasons. I mean, he's an articulate and fine storyteller. His recollection is stark and honest, yet also lyrical at points and evocative of his larger kind of experience. The DIT presents Pinchas as an exemplary figure, as a survivor who personifies the Shoah Foundation's institutional and performative preferences to convey gravitas, authenticity, accuracy, moral weight, and stature. Now, Pinchas DIT and his cohort of interactive witnesses were created using a motion capture system akin to that used to record the bullet time sequences of the Matrix films that we're familiar with, originally starting in 1999. This photographic process grows out of a other process used by Edward Maybridge to successfully capture the image of a horse galloping, horse in motion, 1886. Yet another argument that we're making in this work is that this technology is in itself not all that new. This is technology that has been here since the advent of cinema in the late 19th century. A series of mounted cameras in a row of circles in the matrix are used to photograph images in time from multiple angles against a green screen, and then the resulting images for Pinchas are stitched together to form a complete motion sequence in 3 dimensions. Now, during the motion capture interview process, Gooter sat for over 5 days during 2012, fielding over 2,000 questions from the former director of the Shoah Foundation, Stephen Smith, featured here on the right in this chamber of lights and cameras behind the green screen. Again, it is quite an arduous process. Only those with the sufficient endurance to endure this kind of lighting setup, often having to wear goggles over your eyes to protect yourself from the sun as if in a tanning booth. Smith's questions and Pinchas's responses were then entered into a database that uses Google Voice recognition software to retrieve his answers for playback on screen based on keyword programming by the Shoah Foundation coders and producers. Now, the retrieval process is very important, matches the appropriately coded responses from Gooter's interview footage to the query addressed to the DIT interface, to the simulation of Pinchas. Often the responses match up quite well, but equally often the match is less than perfect. Based on whether replies match consistently or not, audience members typically either project a level of satisfaction onto Pinchas DIT or they grow disinterested and leave the museum space. So you often have these mismatches between what someone asked and the answer that is retrieved from the system. And interestingly, in conversations internally with the Shoah Foundation, what are often the most effective answers in their view are not necessarily the correct answers, those that are historically on track or on point, but those that the user finds to be satisfying. In other words, if a user is satisfied that their answer addresses their question, then that is a satisfactory response. And that might very well, as I'll demonstrate by way of an anecdote, not be in line with the line of questioning or with the line of experience that Pincus had asked or experienced. Now I want to go back, this idea of the voice recognition software, while improving over time, still tends towards misrecognition at certain points. Compelling users to ask concise, to the point questions, often having to reformulate to get their responses heard. Learners of the interface, as you witnessed in that Holocaust Museum exchange with the user from earlier in my talk, cannot be conversational or layered or move from topic to topic in their queries. And if one attempted to vary the types of questions asked, often the responses from Pincus failed to match. So as an example, replacing what is a death camp with tell me about the death camps caused Pincus to respond with a discussion of his ghetto experience. And that may have gone unrecognized by the user. At one point, a user asked, when was the last time you saw your family in the camps? Leads to a part of his interview with Stephen Smith, Under the Lights, that pertained to a visit he took to Majdanek, a camp where he lost his family, with his grandchildren after the war. So when was the last time he saw his family in the camps? Did not pick up on the last time he saw his father, his mother, his twin sister Sabina when they were taken away to their deaths. The question ends up triggering an answer about his post-war experience of seeing his grandchildren visiting Majdanek after the war. So obviously that's a very profound mismatch. At the same time, while there are moments, profound moments, in which there's a decontextualization, in which some of the answers that Pincus gives seem fairly boilerplate, often talking in very broad levels, harvesting answers that could really speak to any and all questions, depending on how broadly they're conceived. Yet in spite of the need for instruction, in spite of the mismatches, which are improving over time, because this is a system that does learn over time, there were moments, both on the part of users in conversations with them and with myself and my collaborator working with the Pincus interface, where we felt that sense of intimacy, of feeling obliged to give Pincus our attention, to give him our active and empathic listening. There were moments in which the effects of being in the presence of a living witness felt very much alive, in which this very disembodied interface created a sense, which is not the same, but a sense of being in the living presence of a survivor. And I think that's not something that we should dismiss. But like all witnesses who had given testimony at the DIT for this virtual witness program, Pincus had given his testimony as part of the Shoah Foundation. In fact, for part of this project, we're looking at multiple iterations of Pincus Guter's testimonies that he's given in Toronto in 1993, in the Shoah Foundation in 1995, in the early 2000s in Cape Town with Stephen Smith before the DIT, before Stephen Smith was even at the Shoah Foundation, in audio tapes, which he gave to a social worker working on issues of slave labor and its after effects in Cape Town. Pincus has written memoirs. Pincus has appeared in virtual reality films. So we're looking at all the multiple iterations of Pincus and the ways in which his experiences and the recollection of his experiences are reshaped by those respective media. And one particular source that we found interesting, they're all interesting, is this snippet of testimony from 19 1995 that was delivered to the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. And I'm just going to show you one little snippet here.
And they, in kind of one fell swoop, you were turned over and you were kind of become part of some kind of bestiality, treated like a beast, worse than a beast. And I think it was from that time on that I started retreating into myself. And I became almost like this video machine. I became a onlooker and recorder of events that was happening. And also I think that the experience, that first experience of being subjected to this kind of inhuman behavior somehow insulated me for the future. In other words, I was like inoculated to a certain extent, because I was 7 and I was given this burst of bestiality in a very concentrated form. So what happened later, which was far, I mean, unbelievable horror, but it somehow did not have that shattering effect, because the shattering effect was done previously. That was the beginning of it.
I find it difficult to be a physical entity. I became a video machine, a recorder, Pincus says. It is precisely his notion of a detailed videographic memory that validates him for the archive and for the witnesses as a reliable, seemingly objective witness, one who has above all else recorded in order to survive and survived in order to record. He looks back on his past with a large semblance of emotional and bodily, both intimacy, but also distance, pathos, but also objectivity, commenting that experiencing his life before the war was almost like filming, and that in the process of filming, his subconscious doesn't allow him to have feelings. He mentions his time in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was born in Lodz, but relocated to the Warsaw Ghetto. Quote, I think that the experience of being exposed to inhuman behavior somehow insulated me for the future. It was like I was inoculated. So what happened later in the war, it somehow did not have that shattering effect. Guder presents himself as someone who, through his exposure to the horrors of the ghetto, had a shock to his system early on, which in his words inoculated him. Although Pincus DIT presents Guder sitting still in his chair, framed from head to toe, as you saw from the clip from the Holocaust Museum, this 1995 video testimony, framed in a very typical medium close-up that is the standard framing composition for video testimonies of the Holocaust, there's something much more spontaneous in that limited frame that you see here. His posture, a sense of his movements, a sense of the spontaneity, a sense of having a closer access to his eyes, to him, even as we see in this kind of frozen moment, the expressiveness of his face, the sense of reflection in his face. We are caught in his gaze as he ruminates. Although the 1995 video was lower resolution by exponential amounts than the razor sharp fidelity of the Pincus DIT image that you saw earlier in this talk, it is precisely the grainy, slightly degraded image of the analog video footage that imbues Guder as an interview subject with a sense of authenticity, we'd argue. Shortly after having viewed Guder's testimony here from 1995 and engaging with the Pincus DIT interface at the Shoah Foundation and again at the Holocaust Museum, we were provided access to the entire transcript of his motion capture interview footage, a transcript that covers more than 2,000 questions and is more than 400 pages in length. In the transcript, Stephen Smith asked Pincus, quote, how do you feel when you were in the ghetto and you saw people lying in the streets? In this response, Guder suggests, as he had in earlier testimony, that something happened to his psyche during the war. I became like a camera. My eyes were lenses. The screen of my mind was celluloid and was recording everything. You know, I didn't have any particular feelings. I mean, obviously I felt sorry when I saw a little boy shouting, give me a piece of bread. I just don't remember having any emotions whatsoever. I was really just an observer, and maybe that's what saved my life. Here, Guder evokes his past testimonies, at least the 1995 testimony, suggesting that he was emotionally numbed. Now, whether or not that is the case, that is what he is recalling about that moment, and that he took on the function of being a camera. At other points, Smith asks Guder whether his memory of the Holocaust is shaped by histories and sources that he encountered after the war. In essence, asking him if his individual memory had been obscured by collective memory. Guder admits, in fact, he insists that he's an avid reader of literature on the Holocaust, but also adamantly contends that he has only ever used those to, in essence, strengthen his memory, not to fantasize about things. He adds that his reading of historical sources has allowed him to cross-verify, in his words, which recollections are accurate and which are inaccurate, preventing him from infecting his recollections with untruths, from blurring the boundaries between subjective and collective memory. Beyond defending his reliability throughout the interview process for the DIT, Pincus also attests to his openness to discussing how he goes about interrogating and reinforcing his own memory. He openly discloses what he attests to be true, while acknowledging those things that he is less able to communicate with certainty or accuracy. In other words, we have a transparent system where there is a recognition with the passing of living survivors to this, in this transition to the post-memory landscape, this idea that there must be some sort of relief of the anxiety that is associated with this kind of new technology, an anxiety that the Shoah Foundation has internalized, has received about this project, has anticipated about this project, and wanting Pincus and other DIT witnesses to assure future users that what they are getting is, in sense, the truth, and that it has been reflected upon, that it has been distinguished from collective memory, that what you're hearing is their truth, and that it's been authenticated. At the same time, questions directed towards establishing Guder as a dispassionate, reliable recorder of events are also geared towards positioning him as a flesh and blood human being who can transcend the realm of the virtual. So he has to be both an authentic recording machine, but also, in essence, replicate the effect of being a flesh and blood living human being. Someone who can convey personality, someone who can convey emotional fragility, as well as objectivity. Guder has delivered video testimony prior to his 1995 videotaped interviews with the VHA, as I mentioned, and very much that process of trying to establish Pincus's relatability, but also his reliability, has been core to that process. There are, in essence, a continuation throughout the multiple interviews that he's given over time to establish a sense that he is a reliable witness, but also a witness who can give you some sort of personal insight into his experiences. But what we found interesting, and this is what I think distinguishes the DIT from the prior interviews that he's given in Toronto, at the Shoah Foundation, in Cape Town, or in his memoir, is the way in which the DIT can often not only detextualize, but in essence, screen out some of the more deeply embedded aspects of Pincus's experiences from the past. And it's with that in mind that I want to kind of head towards the final 10 minutes of this talk. Because more than any other figure in Guder's interviews for the DIT and for his archive video testimonies that came before that is his twin sister, Sabina, who he lost along with his parents at Majdanek. But let me step back for a second, because I would be remiss if I didn't call attention to an earlier image that appeared at the opening slide of this talk. As Dan and I were working on this project, and it's a project we've been doing intense research on over the last 6 years, I should say Dan, who is, in addition to being a film and media scholar, was also a visual artist and a comic artist, started taking sketches of Pincus and of various iterations of Pincus, because he was interested initially just for his own note-taking, to get a sense for how our sense of Pincus changed over time through various media, and to get a sense for how some of the internal work that Pincus was grappling with might be better articulated, and how the experience of us as users interacting with Pincus might be better articulated through visual form. And so he started taking sketches of Pincus. And over time, filling in the detail of Pincus, trying to get a sense through the extensive amount of time that we had spent with the virtual Pincus, to flesh him out as you would, to get a sense of the contours of not only his testimony, but how we interpreted him. And then how we then re-rendered him as a figure who would ultimately take on a life of his own as PG, Pincus Guter. That is, and this is something we can discuss in the Q&A, the idea that over time, whether in his memoirs, whether in his video testimonies, audio testimonies, in virtual reality, and then in the DIT, you are seeing someone, you're encountering someone who is based on a real person, but who is represented in various media forms, who takes on identities that carry with them the various nuances and specificities of those media, right? And so then when rendering Pincus through cartoon form, in essence, allowed us to examine in closer detail our sense of experience of encountering Pincus in these different forms. And it also allowed us to represent, at least we hope to represent, some of the ways in which Pincus's deeply embedded memories became hidden, or in some senses compressed, hollowed out, neglected, perhaps fleshed out, depending on the context, depending on the algorithms that dictated this system. As I said, more than any other figure in Pincus's testimonies, in his memoirs, in virtual reality films, the figure who looms the largest is his twin sister, Sabina, who, along with his mother and father, he lost at Majdanek, never to see them again. He is unable to remember the greatest regret that Pincus has, articulated through each and every memoir and video testimony and virtual reality film and DIT testimony. Throughout each and every, there's one common thread, and that is the regret that he cannot envision his twin sister, the visage of his twin sister. He can only remember her plaits of blonde hair that Dan has rendered here on the top left of that panel. In the DIT transcript, Smith asks a series of questions encouraging Guter to relate memories of his sister, including, what is it that you remember about your sister? And Guter responds at one point, I remember in the Warsaw Ghetto, where vermin and lice were so common, you couldn't run away from them. So my mother wanted to cut my sister's hair because her hair actually was very long, right to her backside. And she always used to plait it, and my sister wouldn't let her. And I remember, of course, the last time when I saw my sister, and that plait of hair when she was hugging my mother. So those are things that I actually remember, but I don't remember her. I remember things of her hair. Guter's recollection of his sister's lice infestation blends into a memory of his sister and mother being separated from him at Majdanek, and then to the memory of her hair. But in this recollection of his sister, he's also bringing back, and thus the kind of shadowy figures above in the middle, bringing back an image of his mother, bringing back an image of his mother by way of his sister. This is a story of remembering and of forgetting. It's not just simply about the sister and her braids, but also about what he remembers of his mother. In that sense, his sister serves as a screen memory, one that can only be analyzed through its multiple repetitions across the larger array of questions and answers that he gives for the DIT interview. Furthermore, the Shoah Foundation, in its anticipation of future uses of the interface as being pedagogically useful, asks Guder repeatedly about his sister and tags his responses so that the system will pick up. Tagging means to designate and to make receivable and accessible for the algorithm various portions of his testimony through the voice recognition software. Various iterations of questions about his sister, hoping that interviewers, or that is, I should say, users, will get access to this core memory, but in a way, ultimately, we argue that is taken out of context of this larger array of memory work that he's doing about his mother as well. That this focus on his sister, which is core, ultimately ends up leaving out discussions both of some of the joy and love that he has for his sister, focusing on the trauma of loss, but not the joy of his life with his sister. That's point one. And point two, that in the focus on the sister, and particularly the traumatic aspects of his sister, leaves out the presence of his mother, who is very much entangled in this memory of his sister and her hair. Sabina's image and her braids are ultimately the point of emphasis throughout the DIT, rather than stories of bringing the Sabbath cholent and the smells and the joy that they shared with each other as they brought the cholent to their parents in the Warsaw Ghetto, even under times of great duress. The golden plates represent, moments of love and care that his mother gave to his sister, not just memories of his sister himself. They are part of a larger constellation of memories about his family that ultimately get narrowed down through the algorithm of the system to focus on loss, and a loss that is represented in the object of his sister's hair, rather than on the stories of his sister and the stories of his mother. But Guder's narratives, stories that have been polished over time through their retelling, should not be understood as simply contradicting his account of himself as a camera, as a recording self. He has memories of his sister, but that they are symbolized at the level of occlusion, of things that are left out. She represents his loss, that is true, but loss is not the only experience that Pincus had. He also had experiences of great joy, experiences of having harassed his sister, of playing pranks on his sister, of apologizing to his sister, of rapprochement with his sister, of the care that his mother gave to both of them. All of those stories which, because of the nature of the algorithm, which picks up on questions that are most frequently asked, tends to leave out those areas of inquiry that aren't asked. In other words, if you are directed towards loss, if questions about regret, as this system has been constructed to pick up on more than other stories, that ends up reinforcing a sense of the loss as represented in the hair, rather than in the experiences of joy under duress and under trauma that existed with him and his sister. We last encountered Pincus, well, at least for this project, in 2018 at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. He was on display this time alongside, in a large exhibition space alongside Eva Schloss, who, as it so happened, was the half-sister, or say half-sister of Anna Frank. And she was both rendered onto life-size screens at this point. And while by this point in the interview, by this point in time, I should say in 2018, which is 2 years after we had last seen Pincus, Pincus is much more agile, much more fluent in picking up on questions that he might have missed prior. But we found something interesting, which was Pincus, in a sense, had become reinforced as an exemplary survivor precisely because he was the first to be rolled out. As I said, the more questions you ask of the interface, the more it becomes fluent in addressing those questions. And because Pincus had been extant as an avatar for at least 2 to 3 years before Eva and others, he had in essence become more refined. And so when Eva Schloss was brought to the fore here, or at least to the stage here, we found witnesses, or say users, being disenchanted with the experience. She wasn't adequately able to address questions posed to her. She was, in essence, not being successful according to the standards of the Shoah Foundation. And so they had to pull her. The Museum of Jewish Heritage had to pull her from the display, and again, just focusing on Pincus. And I raised this question, this issue of Eva and her being taken out of circulation, precisely because we run the risk as we transition to post-memory, this moment of which we will no longer have living survivors around to tell their stories, and we're left with only their mediated forms, that there are certain modes of performance, certain figures who give witness, like Pincus, who will become privileged over others, right? And that has happened with other survivors who have given their testimony for DIT. Dan and I had met with the Shoah Foundation. There was this wonderful, very cantankerous Holocaust survivor, an avid smoker, raspy smoker voice, very confrontational, very gutsy. And they said to us, yeah, no, she's not been very successful. People don't find her relatable, right? So this idea that even certain forms of performance, certain characteristics, certain personalities get preferences over others, are deemed to be more user-friendly. And the reason I bring this up is because although we've been using the word testimony throughout this talk to discuss what is a project after all called New Dimensions in Testimony, or that was its initial name, now just Dimensions in Testimony, Pincus and his cohort represent a form of pedagogy. Not that those two are separate. Testimony has always had a pedagogical function to teach researchers and students certain lessons about the Holocaust, but what distinguishes previous living and recorded testimonies from the DIT versions are that the integrity of the original interview responses and their chronological framework, even if specific video testimony segments were extracted for educational use, there remained intact a complete testimony for each user to potentially access. Those seeking out other facets of an excerpted testimony or hoping to examine a testimony its entirety would not be able to do so. There is no play button that will play Pincus's testimony from start to finish. You must activate it with your own knowledge or lack thereof of the Holocaust. But what does constitute the pedagogical intervention in DIT is a deliberate production process involved in creating each of these virtual humans. The process originates in the premise that the audience and their preferences for modes of performance, for which answers are satisfactory, that those interests, the interests of users, that this is a user-driven editing process. Those are terms that the Shoah Foundation uses itself. This is to be driven by the preferences of the user. There is an explicit stance on the part of the Shoah Foundation which privileges the accesses of the users rather than the agency of the witnesses for this project. In framing encounters with the DIT, we'd argue it is essential to move beyond discourses of testimony in order to better understand how they originate and function as pedagogy. The pedagogical aspects of witnesses' discourse in the museum, in the classrooms, have a long history, and we can better foreground the possibilities of the DIT and what it might bring to the table in terms of the effects of a living encounter to pedagogy. But that is something that is not necessarily testimony with claims to truth, right? When the decontextualization that this process tends to engender, it often compromises the very truth claims that are inherent and foundational to the work of testimony. By moving beyond, in conclusion, invocations of testimony and discussing these and other projects, new media projects that are intended to preserve the Holocaust, in moving beyond this notion of testimony, we can better recalibrate our expectations concerning the setting in which Pincus and his peers function. Pincus simply cannot be a reliable testimonial witness in the way that Pincus Guter in his earlier video and other forms can be. But that means placing the burden of contextual understanding not on these avatars, not on these interactive witnesses, but on the museums and exhibitions that curate him. Museums, archives, and other institutions are the ones who must now be responsible for providing the authentication and contextualization that survivors will no longer able to be providing through living agency. So while we are experiencing a transitional phase in Holocaust testimony when the living witnesses are passing away and the potential for the technological doppelgangers is expanding, the jury is by far and away still out on the ethical implications of that transition. The future of Holocaust survivor testimony appears to be in flux, that there is institutional and cultural anxiety about the passing of survivors, and that is clear. Fortunately, the raw data recorded for Pincus DIT that we've analyzed and of the other virtual survivors is much richer than the actual final product at this stage. As the simulation, replay, and voice recognition database improves, perhaps we will see the potential for these interactive witnesses as pedagogy as opposed to testimony to be more fully realized. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for being such a great audience. And I look forward to hearing your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Noah. I'm going to stop your share for now.
Sorry.
No problem. Great. Okay, and I'm going to ask people to use the chat function to please type your questions into the chat, and be happy to take questions from the audience. So I'll start us off, Noah, with a first question, but I would encourage people, and I already have one that was sent to me, but I just have sort of a foundational question, which is, and you alluded to this at the end, the sort of idea that you'll have Pincus representing kind of an idealized survivor that comes to stand in for the many other, Shoah Foundation has over 50,000 survivor testimonies. Fortunoff Video Archive has over 5,000 video testimonies. You've written about this elsewhere. How many DIT testimonies have been collected, or what was the initial goal for the Shoah Foundation in terms of how many of these would be ultimately sort of rolled out for use in museums and other educational institutions?
I'm not going to give you a hard figure just because it's constantly changing, but it's at least 30 at this point. And that includes also, and it's not only survivors of the Holocaust. So the initial was really to be able to do not as many as possible, because initially the process cost upwards of $2.5 million. Now they've subsequently scaled down into a mobile rig that they no longer require people to go to the campus of USC, to the Shoah Foundation, to sit under that large dome. And so the system has become the process has become more affordable. And not all survivors would be deemed to be appropriate given the demands, physical demands, intellectual, cognitive demands of this process. So many questions over so much time under the lights. At this point, though, we're looking at a minimum of 30 and about a half dozen or so survivors who have given testimony from other contexts, Guatemala, Nanjing, also survivors from, there's some plans for doing Rwanda. And there are also some testimonies that have been given, that are going to be given in Russian language, in German language. The majority of them, the vast majority of them, have been given in English. So already it's a very limited corpus if you think about it. These are mostly American or Canadian emigres to Canada or the United States, delivering their testimony in English that relates to the Holocaust. But there is a process for expansion into other languages and into other genocide contexts.
Okay, and it'll be interesting, as you say, to think about how this, Pincus is the first and the one who's learned the best, and sort of, that the technology is the most developed, but to see how this plays out. But on the other hand, what happens to the other, thousands of testimonies that have been collected if we have sort of 30 ideal ones that end up being used in lots of museums? Yeah.
I mean, this is my, I'll just be frank. I think and I don't get to this in my talk, but I read about this elsewhere, is that I think the creation of these interactive witnesses constitutes, or reflects, I should say, a lot of anxiety, not only in the part, a larger cultural anxiety about the passing of survivors, but also about access to the Shoah Foundation archive itself. You have over 52,000 testimonies of the Holocaust, 3,000 of other genocides, and the sense of the usability, which is unquestioned, but that's different in terms of the numbers of people who are accessing that archive. And I think there's concern to keep up, to make the archive relevant, and to adapt to changing user modes of experience and knowledge, right? And so I think these testimonies represent, sorry, these virtual biographies, if you will, represent to some extent an anxiety on the part of the Shoah Foundation and other institutions like the Forever Project in the UK and other places in Germany, that feels if perhaps the traditional archives aren't being accessed. And so this is a way of trying to connect, to envision what users want and trying to connect with those users. And so I think it's a demand-driven, a consumer demand-driven, user demand-driven process as well.
So I have a few questions that have come in both to the chat and also that were submitted even before your talk with people who were familiar with your work and were interested in what you're working on. So one question that came in comes from Alison Gamo, who has participated in a program that we've done with Voices of Hope, working together with children of survivors who have sort of taken up the work of becoming educators, right? Sort of that next generation, communicating, translating, mediating the memories of their parents for external audiences and thinking about how to do this in the classroom. And Allison asks, what do you think? So you end your talk with talking about sort of the pedagogical possibilities of how this can be used in museum settings, but the responsibilities of educators to use this well. And Allison asks about what you think the role of the next generation, the role children and grandchildren of survivors might play in the future of Holocaust testimony, both I think for, with the examples that you've shown for DIT, but also we can think about sort of traditionally there's a sense that, and I'm expanding on this question, traditionally there's a sense that memory is transferred sort of intergenerationally from one generation to the next within families, and this is how sort of storytelling takes place and how it's shared with broader audiences. But what do you think the implications might be of both the sort of recording of testimonies on video? Does that have implications for how things will be shared from one generation to the next? And what do you think the role of children or grandchildren of survivors might be in sort of translating either DIT or video testimonies for broader audiences?
That's a really interesting question. I guess in terms of let me start with the second question, which is what are the implications for second generations? I think that there's, and to the, I'm familiar with the Voices of Hope project, and I think what is really promising about a project like the Voices of Hope, when you're working with descendants of survivors who can talk about the process of how they heard stories from their parents and grandparents. There's a kind of transparency about the process. There's a discussion about the process, right? It's inherent. You realize that that person is not a survivor themselves, but a descendant of survivors. And so there's already built into that a contract of, there's a genre here of second and third generation memory work, whether it's in the form of Art Spiegelman's Mouse or in the form of various documentary films by Abraham Rivette and others, or in the work of Voices of Hope, where you are aware of the process of communication across generations, which I think is a much more productive way of looking at it, as opposed to having an interactive avatar who, in essence, there's an attempt for that, for Pincus and others to represent themselves as authentic performers of their testimony. But because of the failures of the system, which are very much hidden at the back end and not transparent to the users, you don't have that reflection. You don't have that process of commenting on the transmission of memory as you would otherwise with second and third generation descendants of survivors. Does that make sense? So I think there's an openness and reflection that goes on in a project like Voices of Hope as an example. Can you remind me of what the first question was? Because I just, in giving that answer, I lost track.
Well, no, I think it's really interesting what you bring up, which is sort of the transparency of the process of the memory work that's going on. And it also reinforces something that gets lost in the DIT, which is, and I'll get back to the first part of the question, but in your previous work, you've emphasized sort of, especially I think one of the strongest parts of your first book, Reframing Holocaust Testimony, is the work you did comparing testimonies that were given by the same survivor in different settings, right? So comparing testimonies given by one survivor at the Shoah Foundation and at the Holocaust Museum and at the Fortunoff Video Archive. And you can see the differences for various different reasons based on the institution that's collecting it, or the time of day, or the day of the week, or the audience, and that's something that gets completely lost, I think, as you see with sort of DIT, right? The other part of the question that Allison had asked was, what role do you think children of survivors might play in sort of either with DIT or with other video testimony collections, sort of in facilitating or translating them for broader audiences in the future?
I can't speak as much to that issue of how second generation, I mean, I'd have to, the level of, I mean, it's something I haven't thought about as much. I've thought more about, imagine Pincus or Eva. I mean, what's interesting is that when I went to see Pincus in 2018 at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, there was a temporary exhibit on Lodz, where he was from, and it was just down the hall from him. And he was, because no one asked him, because there's very little contextual information given about his background other than he was born in Lodz and this is where he was in such and such a time and day. People very rarely ask him about Lodz, so much so that you often have to kind of pronounce it multiple times for him to pick it up. Sometimes you got to do Lodz, or it depends, right? But that's interesting, is because he was just down the hall from a special exhibit on Lodz. Well, what if we were to place Pincus alongside a series of other sources and documents in an exhibition on Lodz, where he would be one of various other sources who could serve a kind of pedagogical function in giving some sort of a sense of an embodied reflection on life in Lodz, and then life before he was then relocated to Warsaw. So I think it's, in terms of curation, it's about placing him not as an object that kind of stands in for history or kind of testimony, but as someone who exists as one of a constellation of sources that can help us understand certain experiences of the Holocaust when given the proper context, given the proper curation alongside and in conversation with other sources. That's how I envision it, rather than the kind of the sage on the stage, as very much he represents in that kind of classic pedagogical function, someone essentially lecturing you about his experience on a stage in the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and he's situated much more as a guide on the side to help comment on what other facets of knowledge you're gleaming about, let's say Lodz as an example.
I feel like you've coined some very useful terms here: the sage on the stage and the guide.
No,
on the
that's
side.
all. That all comes from that's all classic pedagogy studies. There's different modes of teaching that we try to stop as university professors being sages on the stages to being guides on the sides.
It's very. I think it's very useful in this context, as you suggest. We have a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to combine two questions that are similar, one from Narit, my mom, and one from Margalit Schindler. They both relate to the question of wouldn't this testimony give an opportunity to Holocaust deniers to have quote unquote proof that all testimonies are manufactured or video productions. Margalit, I'll just read Margalit's chat note, says, "Hi Noah, thank you for your talk. I'm a conservator and specialize in Judaic and Jewish collections. My colleague Jane Klinger at the USHMM has spoken about the need to preserve Holocaust material culture as evidenced against Holocaust deniers who point to facsimiles as quote unquote lies." And Margalit asks, how do you think this idea could play into born digital media, which I think people are more skeptical of to begin with? Can you speak more to this idea of authentication, what that could look like? So the two questions together, does this sort of give more ammunition to Holocaust deniers who want to argue that these testimonies are manufactured? And that Margalit's question, how might this material be sort of authenticated to, in a sense, to respond to that for those who are skeptical of it?
Yeah, no, I think those are really very, very legitimate points. I would start with saying that unfortunately, I think no amount of authenticity and verification is going to be sufficient to counter a Holocaust denier. That's not, I mean, that's not their investment will always be to find cracks in whatever rendering of Holocaust experience there is, right? I mean, whether in the written word or on the media screen. But I do think that there is a concern. What concerns me, in a way, yeah. First off, I very much envision, and this is already possible, technologically feasible, and there's been something that I'm concerned about is the extent to which the DIT interface can be uploaded with by the institution itself, updated with new information that's come to light about Pincus's experience. That you could very much have a Pincus who left out certain details for his DIT rendering, and by using software that is readily available at this point to edit into on the part of the Shoah Foundation, and I'm not saying that they have any plans to do this, but it's something that is not impossible to envision, a kind of an update, like we upload updates to our system to update Pincus based on new information that comes to light. And using deepfake technology and vocal editing software, that's something that is very feasible, totally feasible within this context. So this idea of Pincus and his cohort being updated to suit new sources of information, new media platforms, I think that that's something that is totally foreseeable. And I think when we, and hence I think the contract that comes with testimony is different than the contract that comes with pedagogy. Testimony is a work of somebody making claim to an experience that they had, among other multitude of definitions of testimony. I don't think that it's useful to using the term testimony to describe these interactive biographies, precisely because if judged by the metric of testimony, where of course there's going to be poetic and reflective and musical and interpretations of experiences that are recalled and performed that in many ways challenges our notion of what testimony is, there is underlying that a claim to truth, that what I am telling you is the truth. And because you hear the interviewer in conversation with the interviewee, having a conversation, that there is a transcript that is readily available to the public to read, and the duration and the entirety of the testimony to watch in its entire duration, that contract of I can at least check the source and cross-verify the source, as you would do with any source, is just simply not available for the DIT. So that's the main problem. If you treat it as a work of testimony, it doesn't have the apparatus that is full access to the transcripts, full access to the entirety of his testimony that you could then cross-reference and cross-verify and hence negate the negationists. Right? That apparatus is not in place for the DIT. You just simply wouldn't be able to do it. And so I think those fears are legitimate. So I think if we kind of shift away from discourses of testimony where truth and authenticity are at the forefront, as opposed to pedagogy, where learning and the effects of presence, where us understanding a lesson or us getting a sense of an experience, not as opposed to the experience as it really was, at least in interactive pedagogy, then that opens us up to be less bogged down with the kind of truth claim debates that we would need to use to counter negationists, deniers.
Interesting. Okay. I see a couple more questions. 3 more questions have come into the chat. So we'll keep going on here. So one comes from my colleague Clarissa Seglio, who's at the University of Connecticut and is really working on a fascinating project that uses sort of digital media and video game technology, but also in an educational form to teach the history of the Holocaust. But Clarissa asks, should we consider DIT offerings as a genre within the broader emerging category of interactive film? Also, did you consider the web browser-based versions of interactive Pinka Scooter and Ava Schloss? Might have been a limited time experiment by USC, Clarissa writes, but what would it mean for DIT to be broadly available online outside of a contextualizing institution-based experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've Pocket Pinkus, as I would refer to it as. With the web browser version of Pinkus, which was a limited time offer, so to speak. In a way, I actually felt like that was outside of the gates of the institution, so to speak, was much more liberating. I felt that I could have a sense of play. When in the sense of play, which relates to that first part of the question, for this like a genre of interactive film, where there are various different paths available, right? And where we're being activated in a way which is not just as we're never just passive spectators, we're always engaged in some way. But I think the notion of play, the notion of improvisation, the notion of alternative readings and alternative paths that could be taken within a film or within a game, that is something that I found much more operable, much more at play, so to speak, in the web-based versions, because you in essence weren't being harnessed by, you weren't being pressured by the institution. You weren't dealing with other people in the room with you and how you might, and I think you have a lot of self-disciplining that goes on in the presence of DIT when at a museum where other users are there watching you. There's a sense of maybe I'm going to comport myself in a different way. And I do think that the social contract exerts certain pressures that we witnessed over time. But with the web-based browser version, it was much more, there was that sense of play that it engendered. And by play, I don't mean that to sound trivial. I guess a sense of experimenting with the genre itself and seeing like what kind of experiences could be brought to light by having a more intimate encounter with Pinkus that was outside of the institution. So I found myself, it was precisely through that I was able to really start asking him lines of questioning that I felt were more off the beaten path. At the same time, because the groups of people using that source, the web browser, were not all that many, not all that numerous compared to those using them in the institutional context. Those answers are not going to be picked up as readily as the more frequently asked questions. So that sense of play and spontaneity is still limited by what questions are given what questions are foregrounded more within the system on the manual and artificially intelligence-driven end of things on the back end.
No, and I'll say that, based on what I've observed from my interactions with Pinchas in particular at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where I saw him a few times, and Ava was next to him when I saw him. I think there's quite a bit to be gained from the sort of individual interaction that one might have, let's say through a web browser, than in the museum setting, where it is, as you suggested, right? There's almost like this try out this new technology, experiment with it. People walk up and ask one question, maybe two questions. It may or may not work, as you've suggested, but because of the social conventions of you're in a museum, you don't want to spend too much time in front of that exhibit, you don't get that sort of deep immersive experience that you might get, for example, from sitting with a survivor for 45 minutes if they come to your classroom and share their testimony. Whereas if you're in a at-home setting and you can engage with the DIT, or in a classroom with a teacher, and they can say, we're going to do this for the next 45 minutes, it's going to be a very different experience, I think, then. Let me click the button one time. I see a couple more questions. Good to take a couple more questions here. We've had some really good questions that have come in. One from my colleagues, Sebastian Vogenstein and Sarah Wellen. Hi, I see you up there. Sarah writes, thanks so much for a fascinating and in some respects, and Dean, I see you too, in some respects, also deeply anxiety producing presentation. A two-part question. First, could you say a bit more about what happens when an encounter with a digital survivor, quote unquote, fails, and about the risks of failure in such encounters either now or into the future? And I should note that Gary Starr also submitted a question that also asks about, can you say more about the interactions that you observed between museum goers and the Pinchas DIT? And the second part of Sarah's question, can you say a bit more about how museums can and must fill in knowledge gaps in order to preserve the sense that these experiences are visitor/user driven, which may or may not be a good thing, in parentheses, while also providing adequate context framing, etc. on the other.
Okay. In terms of the question about what to do with those who failed, I do think that there is this, and I appreciate the anxiety. I mean, on one hand, I have a great deal of anxiety about, but also a degree of optimism. Optimism is probably too strong a word. I'm not completely, I hope I'm not coming off as I probably have, as dismissing this as a project that is not worth exploring. I wouldn't be spending 6 years of my life exploring it if I didn't feel that it had some promise. But I think one of the things that does create anxiety is that it does create a hierarchy of different kind of witnesses, much in the same way that the archives that I looked at in my first book did with video testimony. Right, we have exemplary witnesses, as I call them, witnesses who best exemplify the preferences of the institution, the modes of performance, the modes of authenticity. So you have this even in video testimonies, right? This idea of who are the best witnesses to use. And that also includes living survivors at the Holocaust Museum. Who are the best docents? Who are the best survivor docents who are going to bring out to show to our audiences? Who are the most reliable? Who not so reliable? I am by nature, maybe by nature I'm saying I'm boring, but I'm by nature also interested in boring stories, so quote unquote, stories that aren't necessarily given by charismatic people and necessarily feature huge dramatic shifts. I'm interested in the ordinary as well as the extraordinary. And my concern is that testimonies like Ebba Schloss, who does tell of extraordinary experiences, and others, but who might not be performing them in extraordinary ways, will be taken out of circulation. So that's exactly what happened at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It was an experiment that failed. She was put in and she was set up to fail in a sense because she hadn't been used enough, where sitting against the pilot interviewer, a pilot interviewee who had been out there circulating for 4 years already had acquired much more knowledge based on the nature of the algorithm than her. And so she literally froze, her screen froze when I was asking her questions. And within 6 months of my time with her, she was completely taken out of that room of a Schloss. So I think this idea of that we will privilege those who perform best according, and that will meet the interests of the users, right? And those who don't meet the interests of the users, those who are not as adept or as fluent, and that's again, the system that are not as fluent, the avatars, not the people themselves. Though it also might represent their particular personalities, will be pushed to the margins. And so that is a very, very, very profound concern that I have. So my interest is in, can we shift discussion? Can we shift focus away from just exemplary witnesses who do a great job of conveying their story to storytellers who are imperfect, and to stories that aren't necessarily meet our expectations going into particular museums, perhaps stories of not only of trauma potentially, but also of senses of joy and community and family that exist as part of their stories, but that often get marginalized, that get left out because so the majority of the context that's used, and this addresses the second question, the provide knowledge, is at best a brief and Skokie, a brief film that traces the biographical details of that survivor you're about to hear, or a panel on a wall. That's just insufficient, right? I think we need to use, and I already alluded to this, I think we need to not place them, as I said, as sages on the stage, but as guides on the side within exhibitions, as we would a video testimony on the Nuremberg rallies. What was it like to experience the Nuremberg rallies and to have video testimonies, as we already have in Holocaust museums throughout the world, video testimonies and newspaper articles and other accounts of the Nuremberg rallies or of deportations. Also, so too have this technology present to shed yet another light on that experience. So not as the source, but as one of many sources. So that's ultimately where I would kind of address how they need to be placed within a larger constellation of sources and the knowledge that's brought to that particular exhibit as a whole, rather than an exhibit that is solely dedicated to this witness or witnesses alone.
Great, very interesting. Thank you, Noah. We'll do one last question from which I think is a very good question to end with, from our colleague Pascal Vos, who's at the University of Texas. And I'll just say, one of the wonderful things, I know we've been Zooming for 2 years, but one of the wonderful things about being able to do this is we can have you joining us from Melbourne, and we can have colleagues joining us from Texas and Israel and Connecticut, and we're all in the same place. So that is one of the advantages of this 21st century tech. So Pascal writes, fantastic talk. The notion of a, quote, ideal survivor or, quote, preferred narrative is, of course, a long-standing phenomenon and can already be seen in which published narratives / Holocaust memoirs and which survivors, she emphasizes, became canonical, which ones are taught, and so forth. Even there, you see a preference for and predominance of texts that do not complicate the process of remembering or forgetting, that conveys certain familiar tropes. So Pascal writes, my question is, isn't that an issue that is not unique to DIT, which on the face of it does not seem more explicitly user-driven, but one that has been present since about 1950 or 1960 or so?
Yeah, I mean, even before, if you look at the was that the memoir, right? The memoir, the competition that was it that Jeffrey Chandler writes about
the Evo Awakening Lives.
Evo Awakening Lives.
The autobiography contest.
Yeah, this has been. This is absolutely nothing new. I think and this is not a point I focused on. And by the way, this mode of teaching through this kind of interactive media is nothing new. It precedes the advent of what we call, or what we think of as, new technology. It includes interactive teaching using a blackboard, interactive teaching using shadow puppets. Like, we're looking at like a history of interactivity that has existed over centuries. And in terms of Holocaust, just focusing on Holocaust, this is nothing new. This idea of privileging certain witnesses, certain stories, certain tropes. And in that sense, I don't see that as this is part of a large, this is part of a continuum of that. Again, though, I think there's a profound difference, is that what constitutes the text, and of course you have that process of editing, like, you're not, when you're reading a memoir, you're not seeing the hand of the editor, right? You don't have access to the galleys, you don't have access to all of the outtakes necessarily, though of course with the film like Landsman's or of archives, you increasingly do have access to those outtakes. I guess the difference is, in this sense, what I would think is a continuation, but a more extreme version of that with the DIT, is that you have a process where, in the case of Sabina, his sister, and other topics, he is asked sometimes more than 20 times for different versions of the same story, and that they will tag those experiences as being, short version, medium version, dramatic version, failed version, successful version, right? And that each of those versions, the process of production, of repetition, very much baked into that process is, and bringing in children, young adults, to ask questions of Pincus, to draft sample questions of Pincus. Have you ever done Jello shots, Pincus? That's a question. Have you ever done a beer bong, Pincus? That's a question. Have you ever met Hitler? That's a question. Trialing questions that are driven towards anticipation of the user. I think in this case, I think you could argue in many cases that sometimes with those memoirs, it's often at the fore of an editor's concern, certainly with the Diary of Anne Frank, front and center. I would argue, though, here, the instruments of this particular technology and the priority of production are first and foremost geared towards the user at the center. Now, in many ways, you could argue that that has more in common, perhaps, with some of the earlier memoirs where editors were doing that kind of parsing and promotion. But with video testimonies from the Fortunoff Archive and the Holocaust Museum, and even I'd argue to a lesser extent, but still to an extent with the Shoah Foundation, the agency of the survivor is still given more preferential place. That is simply not the case. That is simply not the case in this instance. And so I think that separation, those tropes become reinforced to meet the interests of the users, and that is baked into the process. So much so that, and in turn, you do not have access to all the things that didn't make its way into the final product. So that's I think a very, very different, just a very important distinction.
Well,
it's an excellent question.
Yeah, no, and it gets us to think about the continuities between a long history of Holocaust literature and testimony, and where we are and where we're going into the future. So, Noah, I want to thank you really for a fascinating presentation and discussion. I'd like to encourage everyone to join me in a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Noah. There are additional questions that have come into the chat. I will share those with you later if you want to follow up on all of those. But thank you everyone for being here with us tonight, and thank you, Noah, for joining us from the future, from May 3rd. I hope tomorrow's a good day. So
yeah,
thank you, Noah.
It's a sunny day in Melbourne, and hopefully it'll be a sunny day where you are.
All right, thanks everyone. Be well, stay healthy, stay safe. Bye.